and pay respects to elders past and present emerging. I would also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Indigenous Torres Strait Islander peoples who are attending today. So a little bit of housekeeping, just as I said before, could everyone turn their camera off and mute themselves? I will call for questions after the presentation, but feel free to start popping your questions into the chat before then, and you'll find the chat icon at the top of the screen. We will be recording the session today, and we will make it available to you via a link to our YouTube channel. We only have an hour, but if needs be, we can stay on the line for longer, but let's just see how we go. So during today's session, we will cover topics such as understanding the rules, the impact of the new rules, providing your feedback via the Consultation Hub, which we will have open until the 19th of June, the implementation phase and the transition to the new rules. So our first speaker will be Ben Challender, and Ben will take you through what we are proposing with the GA maintenance rules.
Thanks, Fee. So welcome everyone. First of all, thank you very much for attending today. We know you're all busy people, so we really do appreciate you taking the time out of your day to meet with us. It's really good from our perspective because meeting with current active industry people such as yourselves, it really helps us understand the practical effects of what we're proposing in these new regulations. And then, in turn, that helps us adjust and refine the regulations and the MOSs and the guidance material to make sure that we do actually achieve the objectives we set out to achieve. And just as importantly, we avoid any unintended consequences. So what I will do today is very quickly try and just outline the intent of the regulations, highlight a few of the key policy areas, address a few of the issues and misconceptions that have come through the years. And we will then be able to answer a few more targeted questions. If what we've done today doesn't address the issues that you've raised, then the team remains available to answer any questions. This is not the only webinar. We're also getting out to a few places around the country over the next few weeks. So this is definitely not the last opportunity for you to engage with us and help us understand how this will potentially affect you or people like you. Basically help us do what we're trying to do, which is build a really good reg set for the general aviation maintenance sectors. All right, so this first slide. This slide is a mainstay of every presentation I do because it at a high level illustrates what we're trying to achieve. We have listened to industry. We've also received very clear direction from governments of all persuasions, Senate committees, our board, our executive, that we need to do better in the GA space. Our current rules, they are adequately safe. There are some things we could do better, but relatively speaking, when we benchmark against most of the other countries that we would normally compare ourselves against, like the USA, New Zealand, Canada, European countries more or less, we do tend to have a very prescriptive, overly administratively intensive reg set, particularly for the GA sectors. So what we are trying to do as we move from the car to the CASA is address some of those issues. They're not secrets. They've been around for years and years and years. So what our challenge is to move from that general agreement that we need to do better in the GA space and build a reasonable understanding and hopefully a consensus as to the things that we should do to achieve that overall objective. So when we're talking about Part 43, probably the first and most important thing to do is understand the applicability. So this chart shows a very clear threshold between Part 43 for the broader private and aerial work sectors and the air transport sectors. Part 43 does not affect any aircraft operating in the air transport sectors. Importantly, what we are trying to do is align with the flight operations risk-based regulatory framework. So for those of you who are more familiar with airworthiness processes, an aircraft that is eligible to do air transport operations does not mean that it's necessarily type certificated in the transport category. So it's quite important to understand those two concepts. Part 43 will be applicable to all of those sectors or mini sectors, if you like, subsectors. So broader Part 138 aerial work, all of the flying training sectors, aerial applications, warbirds, all of the private flying, parachuting, all of those kinds of operations that are broadly known as aerial work or private. It does not apply to any of the air transport sectors. So not charter, not RPT, not Part 121, Part 135, Part 133. So there is a very clear threshold there. We also need to understand that transport category aircraft can be used in private and aerial work operations. Equally, non-transport category certificated aircraft can be used in air transport operations. So managing how aircraft can traverse that threshold is one of the key issues that we have tried to address through our consultation and the information we've provided. There are mechanisms associated with that now. We'll talk a little bit more about those later in terms of the issues that have been addressed, but at the outset, just bear in mind this is not about air transport in any way. All right, next slide, please, Finn. So we've been at this for about 3 or 4 years. It's been a hard slog, and the team, I believe, I'm extremely proud of the work they have done. They have put together the most comprehensive policy and explanatory material development that I've ever seen in my 10 years at CASA. We set out on this journey back in 2018 with industry surveys to try and understand what industry viewed as an appropriate basis for the new regs. That resulted in what I would call an overwhelming result of we should be looking at the US FARs as the most appropriate general aviation regulatory set to use as a basis in Australia. Equally importantly, we need to understand that whilst we agree with that, and there's a broad acknowledgement of that principle in industry, we are a sovereign country. So I don't want to get too bogged down in hypothetical debates about whether it would be better to align with the FARs or align with New Zealand or align with Canada or align with EASA. The most important thing is that we end up with a regulatory set that is effective, proportionate, and appropriate for the current Australian general aviation environment. So that is our overriding objective. We have introduced a range of variations from the core US FARs, but we have always been guided by the FAR principles. So our legislation does look different because we have a different legislative system in Australia. We have also taken a lot of input from people like you and introduced a range of adjustments, variations that better suit the Australian environment. We, as the regulator, we can't ignore where we currently sit. So we have a current safe state. We are moving towards a new state that is based on the US FARs. But we equally need to be able to provide people who are currently working safely under the current rules pathways into the new FAR-based framework. So there's a lot of features in there that they look a little bit different from the FARs, and a lot of that is to do with where we are coming from. The other point that we need to make is that the rules are intended to be proportionate. So we have deliberately taken a very principled approach in addressing how we go about this. We have engaged actively with the FAA, and we have tried to consider the things that they think would be good to do with their regulatory set. There's no such thing as a perfect set of regulations. So we have introduced a few of the concepts that the FAA has in mind but has not yet done, particularly in relation to things like turbine engines, which are not a prevalent feature in the US FARs. And so overall, what we have ended up with is a regulatory set that we believe is appropriate and effective, is based on the FARs, but overall, particularly towards the top end of aerial work, where we're looking at complex maintenance for things like turbine engines, transport category aircraft, we actually have a more conservative regulatory basis there, where we are employing things like maintenance organisations more as requirements than appear under the corresponding FARs. So we have done our very best to maintain the FAR principles, but with what we consider reasonable adjustments for the current Australian condition. Fee, next slide. Obviously, red tape, compliance costs, they have been a driver. So we as the regulator, we are obliged to consider safety as paramount, but we are also obliged to consider compliance costs. And if there are ways to achieve acceptable safety outcomes and reduce costs, we absolutely should do that. And so that has been a centerpiece of what we have worked towards with this reg set. The rules are deliberately framed around trying to avoid regulatory costs where we can. So a prime example of what we have in Part 43 is around maintenance organisations. Maintenance organisations have served us very well over the years. It's a very safe construct, but we are quite unique in the world. We are the only like-minded regulator that we would benchmark against that requires a maintenance organisation right down to the bottom of the private sector with your simple, small, private operated aircraft. So we have introduced more privileges for LAMEs to work outside the maintenance organ construct. We really think that this has great potential, firstly to reduce costs, but also to grow businesses. It is a massive step change for a qualified LAME to build a business. So small business has been a massive focus of our work here, trying to find pathways for people who are qualified and competent. They have the underpinning knowledge and competency, they have the appropriate permissions. So how can we facilitate getting those people active? And how can we make this more attractive as a career pathway for prospective new LAMEs? So that does come with a side effect of potentially disadvantaging existing maintenance organisations. So we are trying to maintain the balance there between safety, costs, building new businesses, and not adversely affecting current businesses. So we think we have reached a reasonable balance, but I'm sure that many of you will disagree that maybe the pendulum should be swung a little bit more one way or the other. Overall, I've heard really, really good feedback, particularly from people out in remote and regional areas who have good facilities, people willing to go, but they just can't make the business case to set up a new maintenance organisation with all of the costs associated with that out in those remote areas. So we think this has got huge benefits out in those regional areas of Australia. Next one, please, Fee. So in a nutshell, some of the key points of what's going. It's all based around improving the regulatory system and improving flexibility. So we have a lot of unique Australian features. Our maintenance release, yeah, good system, but it has some undesirable side effects and it is unique. So part of what we're trying to do is re-establish the functional responsibilities around continuing airworthiness management versus maintenance. You would have seen that as a key element of the new part, well, not new anymore, the Part 42 rules. And that will continue to be a feature of all of our rules that as we move from the car into CASA. More flexibility around things like type ratings. So type ratings are still a key feature of licensing. They are and will remain the best way to get broad privileges quickly, but they are not the only way to establish competency. So we're providing more flexibility for LAMEs working under Part 43. Equally, Australian unique ADs that over the last few decades have been created to address perceived or real deficiencies with the maintenance rules, as opposed to type-related safety concerns at design and manufacture. Like that is the natural function of ADs. So similar with the Part 42 work, we are repealing progressively those unique Australian ADs as we move into the CASA. Fee? I don't want to dwell on this too much because it gets a bit theoretical, but one of the most important new features is re-establishing the link between continuing airworthiness and airworthiness certification. So over many years, we have lost that link in our regulatory framework to our detriment. Under the current rules, we have features like Schedule 5. Schedule 5 is actually a pretty good system if you've got an aircraft that's unsupported. The problem with it is that it's been applied generally, and so the standards that underpin it lose some of their effectiveness. Part 43 will have a similar kind of approach, but it is tied definitively to the aircraft certification basis. So you lose that ambiguity that comes in with the current rules around what maintenance needs to be done. We have a much clearer safety basis for the continuing airworthiness regs. And then the last point there, something that we've held on very tightly to, is the new feature of the inspection authorization. So whilst LAMEs will be the centerpiece of Part 43 and remain the primary maintenance providers, the last probably several generations of LAMEs have never been trained effectively to understand an aircraft certification basis. It's therefore unreasonable for us to expect a LAME to be able to make a judgment as to whether an aircraft complies with its certification basis. The inspection authorization is the function that addresses that competency. So LAMEs, again, the centerpiece, are the future inspection authorization holders. You have to be a LAME first, but you also have to pass a CASA training course to demonstrate you have the competency and understanding of that Part 21 certification basis, which is the safety basis of the annual inspection under Part 43. Fee, next one. So whilst those to people who are active in the industry, they might seem like pretty big changes. In reality, taking a step back, all of the core elements are still the same. So registered operators remain responsible. Maintenance records are still required. Tools, data, facilities, competent personnel, equipment, all of those things, the performance rules that underpin maintenance are still required. It's just a more outcome-based approach to how we go about regulating the GA sectors, really. And that's appropriate that we do have proportionate standards for those sectors. We're not seeking to maintain organisational structures and administrative requirements that are more appropriate and required for the air transport sectors. Fee? All right, so implementation, we can talk a bit more about this if you've got questions, but we are trying to maintain that balance of allowing people to transition their existing businesses reasonably, but equally trying to get these new rules underway as quickly as we can, particularly things like IAs that are necessary for the system to function properly. We want people to be able to access those privileges and permissions as soon as we can. So some features will come in, like a person will be able to do the IA training and get an IA after about a month. Some of the other things, like car 30s continuing to work as car 30s, are able to continue using their existing approvals under Part 43 for up to 3 years. Fee? Right, so as you know, consultation is now open. That's really good. It's a big step forward for us. Things are starting to become very real. If you've been following us over the last 3 or 4 years, there will be no surprises there for you. Everything that we have done in these new regs, these draft new regs, reflects the policies that we agreed a few years ago. So please go in, and we ask all of you, whilst there's a lot of material there, we have really tried to frame it around what is relevant for particular industry groups. So not everybody has to read everything. That would be unreasonable and actually not particularly efficient. It's more important that people read the bits that are relevant to their function. And please let us know, firstly, if we failed to accurately represent the policies we agreed. Secondly, if there are any unforeseen consequences in the legislation. So please get in there, provide us your comments, keep in touch. Everything like that helps us do a better job, and we really appreciate the effort. Okay. Right, so what we've seen to date, it's been open for a few weeks. It's overall very positive. People have been very congratulatory almost of our explanatory materials. There are a lot, but things like the PEG, the Plain English Guide, and the information sheets are going down very well. So I encourage you to get in there and read the ones that are relevant for you. We've actually had compliments on the legislation, which is nice. I would say overall, most legislation these days is getting to the point where regular people would find it hard to understand all of the cross linkages and the legal terminology, but it's nice when people say that it is actually penetrable, which is good, and very complimentary of the benefits that are expected to accrue for industry. Some of the concerns that have been raised, these are not new, by the way, but over the last few years, that issue of how do operators manage aircraft transitioning up into air transport? Well, the point there is we already do that. So an aircraft operating as a private aircraft under the CARS, moving up to Part 42, that issue needs to be managed by the operator and the AOC holder, the CAMO. So essentially the same paradigm will occur. There are existing mechanisms within the regulatory framework, like airworthiness reviews, and existing mechanisms and procedures in industry. So nothing to be afraid of there. Fee? Maintenance permissions. So we are unapologetically providing more flexibility for lamies. That is one of our objectives. It's actually, this is one of the areas, again, we all agree we need to do better for GA. We all agree that Part 66 is very complex, very administratively difficult. Just this morning, I got an email from a long-time industry participant who said he still cannot understand Part 66. He's never used his Part 66 license because he was assured by CASA that what he had before he will continue to have. We need to do better in Part 66. So we are bringing forward some more flexibility in that space for lamies. It is proportionate and appropriate, but it is different. There are other work activities underway through our GA work plan to do more targeted Part 66 work, like a new GA license. So obviously a new GA license would have different, more proportionate standards than the license that's applicable up into the air transport sectors. So there are a lot of mechanisms we can use. We are activating some of them now. AMTCs, they are effectively a transition for existing permissions, but maybe those aren't apparent to a lot of you. things like maintenance authorities, 42ZC6 authorization. So those AMTCs are primarily transition for existing arrangements. They're not meant to circumvent licensing. Licensing is the centerpiece of Part 43, but not every maintenance permission needs to be a license. Licenses, we need to maintain the integrity for the air transport sectors. It always has been appropriate to have other permissions that are more scalable as you move down the sectors. IAs, we can talk about IAs. It's new, but we've got lots of information on the website, so that's an ongoing process of education. And ultimately, there are people who still have concerns about safety. We don't. We have concerns about how well this proven safe system will be implemented. So that is CASA's primary objective over the next 6 to 12 months, is making sure we take a proven safe system that's underpinned airworthiness regulation in many countries for many years and make it work here. So we do actually get the safety outcomes that we know can be achieved under that system. Right, so I think that's all from me. I hope that wasn't too onerous, but I hope it also dispelled a few myths, and I've seen a bunch of questions coming in. So Fee, over to you.
Well, thanks, Ben. We will go to questions. There's a number already in the chat, so I will progressively go through them. But if it's easier for you to ask a question rather than type it in, please raise your hand, your virtual hand. To do this, hover over the reaction icon at the top of the screen and choose the raise your hand, but please don't forget to put it down, because I don't want to have to keep asking you, have you got another question? If you do have a question in the chat and we do run out of time, don't despair. We will take it on notice and get back to you as soon as we can. So I might just kick off with the first question, and it's from Stephen Ray has asked a few. So I'll give this one to you, Ben. How does CASA define competency these days?
Well, it is essentially making sure that a person has the necessary skills, attitude, knowledge, experience to do the function that they are authorised to do. So it is a very, very broad term. Steve, given your background, I would guess that this is framed mostly around competencies for doing maintenance. So as an example, Part 66 is a very, very thorough competency-based framework that allows CASA to have confidence when they issue a license to a person that they can do the required maintenance safely. But extrapolating from that, it's not the only way that CASA can get the necessary degree of safety assurance that a person can do the scope of maintenance that they've been authorised to do safely. So licenses are a key part of the international airworthiness regulatory system. We, throughout the design of Part 43, have been very mindful of making sure that we maintain our ICAO compliance for Part 66 and licensed engineers. So all of the additional flexibilities and the other non-licensed maintenance permissions are framed very deliberately as Part 43 maintenance permissions, so that we don't adversely affect the competency-based framework for licensed engineers. So it is a balance. This is one of these things with policy. There is often more than one right answer, and which one is more right really depends on your point of view. So our objective was to provide more flexibility for competent people working on GA aircraft, particularly smaller, simpler aircraft. We've activated a few regulatory mechanisms. We've retained a few, we've transitioned a few. So overall, competency is a relative term, and it's relative to the scope and the function that a person has been authorised to do. So I know that's a bit vague, but I hope it illustrates some of the challenges that we face when we are trying to facilitate an authorisation for a person to do something. We think we've achieved a good balance here.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up to Ben's response there? If you can hear me.
I can hear you, Fee.
Okay, so Ben, with that, why would you then use the word competency to describe what it is that you're permitting in 43 when you've just said that competency is a certain thing? It's knowledge, experience, practical training, and attitude. When what you're allowing in 43 under your flexibility arrangements doesn't meet that standard. So why do you use the same term for both things?
Well, like I said, Steve, it's a relative term. I suspect that we will probably have to agree to disagree on this, but we've done our analysis and we believe that the standards and the additional flexibility that we've introduced into Part 43 is appropriate. And we've had good feedback from lots of people in our technical working groups and industry more broadly, saying that they agree and they welcome the additional flexibility. But obviously, it is a concern. It's new. So for license holders and people who have a background in, say, training organisations, it is something that is new. So we are managing that. But like I said before, our real challenge is to make sure that when we move towards these more flexible, more outcome-based arrangements, they are understood and used appropriately by industry. And in the first instance, that's a big education campaign for us to make sure that license holders understand the new scope that's available under Part 43, understand that it doesn't flow up into the air transport sectors, and other maintenance permission holders, which we will be framing as AMTCs, that they also understand the limitations of their permissions.
Now, Steve, I can see that you have another question, but I will come back to it. I just want to give everybody else an opportunity to ask theirs. So, Ben Morgan, I can see that you've got your hand up. So I will go through your questions now. You ask 3 questions. How many LAMEs are there in Australia? How many current Car 30 holders and how many Part 145 orgs are now in operation? So Ben, off the top of your head, are you able to come up with it?
Yeah, so I believe the current number of LAMEs that people that we've issued licenses to is between 8,000 and 9,000. They may not all be active, but that I think from our last corporate report is about right. We have between 500 and 600 Car 30 organisations, which progressively over the next 3 to 4 years we'll be looking to transition into a CASAR construct. And we probably have around about 200 145s. So it's still a very high proportion of organisations under the old car regs because we've only thus far transitioned the RPT sector, which has become scheduled air transport. So there is a massive body of work ahead of us as we look to finally complete this reg reform program. And obviously that means maintenance organisation standards are currently under review. Everything that we did 10 years ago for 42 and 145 was framed around the RPT sectors. So it's pretty prescriptive. It's appropriate for most of that top end of air transport, but we've got a lot of work to do to make sure that we actually deliver on that proportionality promise. I hope that answers the question. If anybody's interested in the data, by the way, it's in the CASA corporate report, which is on our website.
Yeah. Now, I'll go to Chris Boyd because he's had his hand up for a while. So, Chris, do you have a question, or we'll move back to the chat?
Yeah, you mentioned 80-inch getting repealed. What happens to engines running on condition, and like in the ag sector? Which, if that is repealed, is that my take, or is that, did I misread that?
In general, we believe that's covered by the regs, so I might cut you over to Mick English for that one.
Oh, Chris, I didn't hear the first part of that question.
Oh, I caught that 80 5 and 80 Prop 1 were getting repealed. So a lot of turbine engines run on condition or at above engine recommendation to overhaul. So if that gets repealed, what happens to those? What happens to those engines?
They'll probably, in most cases, they will just be picked up by preservation of the existing systems of maintenance that people have, which were provided for in Part 43 transitionals, and also, future inspection programs can be approved using those principles since they're already a proven safe construct.
So new aircraft can be grandfathered onto old systems that we're currently running.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So we've just got one more question there about the timeline for adopting CASAR 43. In the plain English guide, it says that there's the option there for early uptake of it. So we have quite a significant training burden relating to type-rated aircraft that this will help alleviate. So we're very eager to uptake the regulations early and in a manner that we can rely upon the uptake date so that we can deliver our contracted services. Is there any sort of assurance we can get on that, or a process to take them on early?
Is that for me?
I'd have to say that unfortunately the only assurance I can give you is that we will do our best endeavours to get this up and running as soon as possible. Beyond that, it's new regs, there's a new government. I'll be blunt and say that not everybody agrees with what we're trying to do. So there's still a lot of work for us to do, but we agree with you, your sentiment that this has good potential benefits for industry to expand their businesses, particularly in those GA sectors. So we're doing everything we possibly can. That's about all I can give you, but feel free to lobby people more powerful and influential than me.
Thank you.
I'm sure the new government would look for initiatives. Hopefully it's general aviation.
Okay, so now we'll go on to the next question. We have a question from Rob. I might bring Neil in because it's in relation to IAs. So you there, Neil?
Yep, I'll hear for you.
Okay, I'll fire away. How many IAs would a warbird operator need if they have several LAE/MPERS?
Yes, LAMEs and permission holders.
Yeah.
Now, Mick might correct me if I'm wrong here, but if for limited category aircraft, there's going to be an AMTC 5, so Aircraft Maintenance Technician Certificate 5, which will replace the MPERS permissions. Your LAMEs will still be LAMEs, of course, but they'll be maintained by the system approved by the association and won't require LAMEs. Won't require IAs. Is that correct, Mick?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so don't disappear. While we're on the subject of IAs, I have another question from Steve Ray in relation to that. His question is, isn't the IA function simply performing the equivalent of an airworthiness review?
Yes, Steve, the airworthiness review or the documentation review is only part of the IA's function under an annual inspection. Excuse me. Under the proposed legislation, the IA will perform or supervise the annual inspection of the aircraft itself, and part of that annual inspection is to carry out the document review for approval of major modifications and repairs, ensuring ADs that are required are complied with, airworthiness limitation items are done, that sort of thing. So it's not just an airworthiness review, it's the actual annual inspection itself as well, and the conformance of major modifications and repairs.
Thanks, Neil. Sorry. So I was the reason I asked that was I looked at the checklist requirements for annual, progressive and 100-hour inspections, and it's the same inspection, it's the same checklist. So it looks like a lamey can do a 100-hour inspection. The annual inspection is the same physical inspection, but it has the airworthiness review proportion. Why do you need the IA to do the actual physical inspection as well?
Someone's feedback. The IA is doing an annual inspection to ensure that the aircraft meets its type design. So that's part of the airworthiness review process. Whereas the, if you like, the lamey doing the 100 is just doing an inspection.
Yeah, but it's the same. They're using the same checklist.
Yes.
So it's the same physical inspection, but the IA on the annual is essentially doing an airworthiness review for the type certificate and the ADs.
Yes.
So it's the administrative function of assuring what needs to be done is going to be done. But then the person who's actually doing the inspection is essentially exactly the same person or qualified as the person doing the 100-hour.
The IA will have a higher level of knowledge with regards to type certification and compliance with modifications and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, but so during the 100-hour, that's not important. But during the annual for the same inspection, it requires a higher level for the physical inspection of the aircraft. Is that so? That's I've been asked that question. I'm just trying to get my head around the difference between the annual and the 100-hour inspection. It looks like it's the same inspection, but you've got the added part of the compliance check with the maintenance required, which is sort of the administrative side, but the actual knowledge and experience of the lamey doing the inspection seems to be the same.
Yeah, I suppose it's the difference between doing maintenance and an understanding of type certification and compliance with modifications and that sort of thing. So I agree with you that the way the inspection is laid out is the physical job of doing the inspection will be exactly the same. However, the annual inspection will be carried out by a person who has more knowledge of type certification basis, recognition of approval, modifications that will require approval and that sort of thing. But yeah, I don't deny that. Yeah, a lamey is required to do the annual, and a lamey who's also an IA is required to do the 100.
Yeah, so yeah, that's fine. It just seems to me like the IA is just performing the Part 42 airworthiness review once a year, and it just seems like an added bit of red tape to require the person who's doing the annual inspection to be also an IA.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there as a final word on this one. Steve, we can obviously take this discussion offline so that other people have an opportunity to comment, but it is it's a subtle issue, but it is a different regulatory function. As Neil points out, the annual is a one-off annual event for all aircraft under that system. There are aircraft under that system, particularly aerial work aircraft, that potentially rack up thousands of hours. So it's a balance between making sure we have the right competencies available often enough in the system. So we're activating, consistent with how it works in all the other FAR-based arrangements, you're activating that higher competency standard annually, and then as often as required based on the utilisation of the aircraft, you're allowing a more generic inspection to be done by people who are more prevalent. If what happens in Australia is similar to what happens in other countries, there will be a lot more lameys than IAs. They will be more dispersed. It's an easier event. So it's just about getting that balance. Obviously, we'd love to have maintenance organisations and Part 42 all the way down. That'd be really, really safe, but it's not proportionate and it's not necessary. So it's just about trying to get that balance and making sure that we can re-establish that link back to how a person decides whether an aircraft is safe, make it less ambiguous, and make sure we have that competency in the system.
Thanks, Ben. Steve, I've noticed that you do have more questions. So to be fair to other participants, I will defer to them first, and then if we have time, we will come back to your questions. But as Ben has said to you, he's more than happy to organise something for you offline. So I will kick off with the next one. Andrew Kendrick, you've had your hand up for a while. Do you have a question?
G'day, yeah, thanks for taking my question. I guess I'm a new aircraft operator, but what I was surprised to see, so I'm a professional engineer in the alternative field, but I was amazed that as the RO, I'm responsible for the maintenance, but there's just no system whatsoever to ensure the person I engage is suitably qualified. It just seems like there's a real disconnect between authority and responsibility in pretty much every other regulated industry, whether it's a lawyer or a doctor or whatever you like. You can go to a database and find out if that person is indeed qualified as they claim they are. But for some reason, their system doesn't exist for CASA. So I guess just to get straight to the point, how as the RO can I be held responsible if I'm not given the tools I require to ensure the person I engage is doing the job as they say? And also just, I guess as an extension to that, so basically if I take my car in to get a service and they say you need 4 new tyres and I think, well, I know I've just replaced those, I don't think you do, I can go and get a second opinion. But unfortunately, when it comes to my aircraft, the second it goes in, it becomes grounded until the maintenance work is complete. Now, I'm sure most people would do the right thing and be reasonable, but there's just no system in place whatsoever to ensure that the work being performed is actually necessary, or that it's reasonable, or that even the person doing the work is suitably qualified that I can see.
So Andrew, I take it your question is about how the registered operator establishes the competency of their maintenance provider. Is that sort of where you're angling?
That's basically where I'm. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So overall, we expect LAMIs, so Part 66 license holders, people who have licenses issued by CASA, to be the primary maintenance providers. It's quite similar to what we have now. Your car analogy, as much as I'm not a big fan of car analogies because cars don't fall out of the sky if things go wrong.
No,
it's quite similar. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like you can buy a car, you can be the owner of a car. How do you establish that the person you have asked to maintain your car is competent? Well, there are qualifications that can be requested and verified in the same way that you can verify the license of the LAMI that you have employed to work on your aircraft. Same with an IA. So there are systems where you can establish that a person has the required qualifications, but as to the quality of the work and making judgments around that, well, I suppose it really is a case of if you are concerned as the owner or registered operator, you can get a second opinion, but there's only so much that can be done in that space. It's actually refreshing in a way to hear a registered operator trying to get a better handle on their responsibilities, because one of the ongoing concerns that we have as a regulator is that the registered operators typically are not very knowledgeable in airworthiness matters, and it's really important. So we are trying to take this opportunity to educate registered operators around their responsibilities, what's important, but we do have trouble with engagement and understanding. It's actually pretty complicated. So it's good that we have an RO who is a qualified engineer as well.
Well, I mean, if I'm going to be held responsible, I need to understand the detail, I guess. But I guess that was to my point. There's no database. I can't say, okay, my aircraft is of type X and it has this sort of engine in it, which happens to be a vintage aircraft. Okay, I want to look up a database and find someone who can do that work. That it just doesn't exist. You sort of call around and you hope for the best. And the person on the other end of the phone might swear they know how to do it, and maybe they do, maybe they don't, but there doesn't seem to be a system in place. And if I'm responsible for it, I guess I'd like the authority with it as well, because responsibility and authority are closely coupled in my mind anyway.
Well, Yeah, so look, there are ways to verify that a person has the required permission. If you do have concerns, then you can obviously fire a question into CASA and verify whether a person has the permission that they are claiming that they have. So at that level, I think your concerns are probably addressed. But if you've got more specifics, then I don't know, we can carry this discussion on another time.
Yeah, I'll go and let other people get their message in as well, I guess. But yeah, just on that point, I did actually ask that question of CASA, and the response I got returned was that they wouldn't release any personal data about a provider.
Well, all right, we'll take this offline, but I'm sure there would be a way for us to verify that the maintenance provider you've engaged does have the scope that would be appropriate. I'm sure we could find a way to assure you of that concern.
Thanks for taking my question.
Ben, I can see that you still have your hand up, but please bear with me. I'm just going to defer to Aaron Smith first, and then I'll come back to you. So Aaron, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I'm with Andrew. As a Car 30 chief engineer, I've tried to get information out of CASA about lamies that I'm employing to make sure that they still hold current licenses, and have been basically told the same thing, that they will not release any information on those lamies. So again, basically to Andrew's question, I have a very similar question. Where is that database going to be kept, and will we have access to that database to create that safety case? In addition to that, we do a number of C of A's and various other things, and there doesn't appear to be a database for major modifications or 337s or EOs. You're talking about a lamie being responsible to maintain the certification status of an aircraft. How does he do that as an IA without that ability to investigate that database? Like the FAA has a database, I can go to Oklahoma City and pull that information. I do not see that within CASA, and I've broached that question a number of times when I've done annual inspections and I find repairs or modifications to an aircraft that I don't meet the original intent of that aircraft. So how are you going to address that?
It's essentially status quo. So you're right, we don't maintain a database of industry-based approvals. We provide a database at a high level of things that CASA approves. So things like STCs, type certificates, that kind of level. But if an industry person has engaged an industry design organisation to approve a design, or has engaged a maintenance organisation or a lamie to do a modification or repair on their aircraft, the data that supports that really is a matter between the person doing the work and the person approving the work. So it should be part of the aircraft's maintenance records.
That doesn't answer the question. The question is, as the IA that then has to do a certification a number of years later, how does he know when those records have been lost out of the logbook? Is that aircraft then grounded and it all has to be redone again? Or is there going to be a database created?
No, so we're not intending to keep a database of industry-based approvals. We do occasionally get concerns around lost paperwork and whatnot. We can usually find a way to work through that, but ultimately industry-based data is something that needs to be controlled by the registered operator or the maintainer or whoever is responsible at the time for doing the work. So I appreciate your concern, but
it's a major safety concern is what it is. It's something I've spotted since I've moved back to this country as being a major flaw. I've tried to produce it a couple of times and everybody seems to go, oh yeah, you'll find it. I know of EOs that have been guys that have signed EOs off, they've gone under, their data has been given back to CASA and CASA has not kept the records of that. So there is technically those aircraft, in my opinion, should be grounded and scrapped because there is no safety data to keep that aircraft maintained.
Well, like I said, we can usually find a way. Like obviously if there's a major mod or a major repair, that is a serious issue. But we, as far as I know, have never had to take such an extreme step as to ground an aircraft because of a administrative issue around records. So, look, I haven't been around forever.
The FAA had to do that recently with seat feet produced by Robin Air because they didn't meet the requirements, and that's where I guess I'm coming from.
Right. Well, look, yes, I acknowledge your concern. It's not the first time this concern has been raised. We decided that, consistent with our current arrangements, we are not looking to increase CASA's role in being a repository for industry data. I suppose that's an open concern that you have, but this is the direction we're going, and it's consistent with where we are now. And I don't think we have the data to suggest that CASA needs to step into that space and do that function on behalf of industry.
Yeah, how you going, Mark?
Good, thanks. Good. Hey, just a quick question, because I mentioned you're getting
I will just try and mute. So, sorry for the interruption, but I think Andrew will probably have to take that one offline if you want to discuss that further.
So we might go to the next question. Before I do, Peter, who has just joined, would you mind turning your camera off and muting yourself? Now, Ben, did you have another question, or you've just forgotten to take your hand down?
Can you hear me there? Am I coming through?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah. Look, thank you very much, obviously, for the webinar today. It is appreciated. Before I put the question out, I'd just like to make a general statement, because I know that this is being recorded and we have obviously the CASA team here. Firstly, just with respect to education across the industry of these proposed 43 changes, it appears to myself at AOPA and our board that the amount of information that's currently available to both maintenance companies and to aircraft owners and operators is actually quite little. And I'm sitting in a room right now with this webinar with a number of maintenance operators and industry persons, and the feedback that we're getting is that people are just generally completely unaware as to how these changes are going to impact their business, their operations, their licenses. And so what I'd like to suggest is that, is it possible for CASA to rapidly produce some very basic case studies that provide a concise and clear answer to some of these basic fundamentals, such as, I am a Car 30 operator today, or a maintenance provider today. I employ 2 or 3 engineers. We're working on general aviation aircraft that fit within this segment. What does my business look like today, and what will my business look like tomorrow, and how will these new regulations impact on our operations, our workflows, and our legal requirements? And I guess alongside that and in parallel, and I understand that this would need to be taken offline, but I believe that the same basic case study approach needs to be taken with respect to aircraft owners as a registered owner and as a registered operator. What will it look like with me operating a VH registered general aviation aircraft today on a manufacturer's system of maintenance versus what it will look like under a 43? And likewise, if I'm owning and operating an aircraft that's being operated on Schedule 5, what will that look like under Part 43? Likewise for the lamies, I'm inundated at the moment with emails and letters from people right throughout the maintenance industry who are asking me, Ben, what does this mean for my license? What does this mean for me as a person, as a professional within the industry trying to make my way? How will this impact on my training? How does this impact on my ability to work, my ability to participate? And the simple answer there is I actually don't even have that information for them myself, because I don't understand it. And so I guess that information is pivotal in our industry being able to productively respond through the consultative process. And I would ask the question, how are we expected to provide a consultative response to a major regulatory reform and change initiative if we don't have available to us concise examples as to how this would impact? And so one of those brief case examples, I believe, Ben, you may be able to answer for me today, which is my direct question for this group right now, and that is, I own a VH registered Beechcraft Bonanza 1968 E33C. It has been maintained for the past 20 years on Schedule 5. how will that aeroplane be maintained under 43? As the registered owner and operator of that aeroplane, what is that going to look like for me tomorrow under these new rules?
Sure, thanks for the question, Ben. So in relation to the broader question, we have prepared a lot of information out there. So I think that it's probably just a matter of maybe better identifying things like those case studies. We really did focus and identify very early on, and then focus on producing things like case studies. So the question like, I'm a layman, what does Part 43 mean for me? I'm a registered operator, what does Part 43 mean for me? So the information is there. It's probably just a matter of bringing it to the surface. And look, we're more than happy to work with groups like you in terms of distributing that targeted information to your members and people out in industry who would like more targeted information. I do acknowledge there's a lot of info out there. It can be hard to find what you want. So yeah, the more help we can get from industry people like yourself, the better it will be for everybody. In terms of the answer around your Beach 18, so you're generally speaking fairly small, simple aircraft. It's been operating under Schedule 5 in private operations, I'll qualify, or training operations. So if that aircraft has been used for an air transport operation, then Part 43 has no effect. The current rules that apply to that aircraft, if they're operating as a small charter under the CARS, then they keep operating as a small charter under the CARS, unless they want to drop the aircraft back down to private operations. If they are operating that aircraft in private or aerial work or training, for example, operations, then the Part 43 rules can apply. And in that case, it's analogous. Right? So what I really want to avoid is trying to frame the new regulations through the lens of the old regulations or the current regulations, because that's where we end up with issues where 5 or 10 years later, people don't actually understand the system, and we've got some kind of Frankenstein's monster of old cars with new Part 43. So in a nutshell, the registered operator / owner remains responsible for that aircraft. They are responsible for working out what maintenance is required and when. They're responsible for making sure that the aircraft has its annual inspections carried out. And if it's doing more than 100 hours a year and is doing something like a flying training operation with passengers, then potentially the 100 hourlies start kicking in. The annuals would need to be done by an IA holder. 100 hourlies can be done by lamies with appropriate scope. Obviously, as now, the registered operator is responsible for ensuring that all mandatory maintenance is carried out. So things like airworthiness directives, airworthiness limitations, if they fall outside the time frame of an annual inspection, and they need to be done when they're required. Life limited parts that are actually mandatory life limited parts, same deal. Potentially a difference there is around the vagaries of the current cars. So some of the maintenance, like SIDS was a good example, okay? There was a long-standing question as to whether SIDS is mandatory or optional if it wasn't mandated by an AD, or if your aircraft didn't have those inspections in the airworthiness limitations. So Part 43 does mean that some of those things are clarified, but really it's on the registered operator to review the continuing airworthiness responsibility requirements for their aircraft and have that required maintenance done by an appropriately qualified person at those intervals. So it really is very similar for that simple small aircraft. If during that period as well they want to modify it, or they have a hard landing and need to do some repairs, then that would trigger the same kind of scenario. They need to contact somebody like a LAMI or a maintenance or to get the aircraft assessed. If it needs an approved design change, you contact your authorised person for a Part 21 approval. If it's a fairly simple modification, then it can just be done by the LAMI. If it's a major modification, the major modification would need to be signed off by an IA. So look, whilst it's analogous, there are a few differences there, which is, yeah, more than happy to work with you around the kinds of questions that are relevant for your members, and we can put together either a new info sheet or potentially just amend the ones we've got or bring them to the surface or distribute them. So more than happy to work with you on that one.
I appreciate that. And just a follow up to that, I think it's been spoken to in some sense by some of the previous questions, and that is in relation to the training of the IAs and the engineering people that will be working on these aircraft. My understanding from the 43, this proposed 43 maintenance regulation package is that we're taking this from the US system, so we're adopting a US package, but are we in fact adopting with 43 the relevant US FAR parts such as 91 and 65 that will also support 43, so that what we don't end up with is a 43 in part but not complete?
So yes, we are aware that in the US system there are relevant rules in other places. So we are somewhat constrained by our regulatory framework. So that scenario that you're talking about, it's not a yes or no answer. It really is a case of we have identified the bits that need to come across from other places in the FARs. For the most part, we have accommodated those in Part 43 because convention in Australia has generally been that the continuing airworthiness regulations reside in a continuing airworthiness part, as opposed to having what they've got in the US system where they have a Part 43, which is supplemented by more targeted regulations in the operational rules. So we believe we have picked up all of those things. Most of them have been placed in Part 43. There are a few variations, again, to suit unique Australian scenarios. We haven't been able to pick up everything from the FARs and put it in exactly the same place as they have it in the FARs, but we believe we have covered all of the necessary things to provide overall equivalent outcomes through the Australian legal framework. But like I said before, with a few variations, like as an example, we have retained the IA system that they use in the FARs. We have framed that slightly differently, and we have introduced an avionics IA that is not in the American system. They only have an IA. We started out with that proposal because that's what they do in the US. That was our baseline. But after having consultation with SMEs, particularly avionics SMEs, they said, well, really, it would be more appropriate to have complex major avionics modifications signed off by a person with expertise in that area. So we took that on board, and that's what we've done. So it is not, like I say, it's not a yes or no, but we believe we have picked up all the essential elements, and the variations we have introduced have, generally speaking, been to make sure we've got a good reg set for Australia. So I hope that answers your question, even though it might have come across a bit rambly.
No, I appreciate that, Ben, and also appreciate the ability to meet with yourself and your team a little bit later on these issues, and no doubt there's still 1,000 questions for you, so good luck with that. Thank you.
Thanks, no worries.
You are correct, Ben. There are still quite a few questions, and we have gone over time, but Ben, if the team's prepared to go for a little bit longer, we'll push through maybe another 15, 20 minutes, if that's okay.
Sure, look, it's been hard to get out and about over the last few years with COVID. So I think these are good mechanisms. I'm more than happy to keep going.
Okay, now we do have a question from Darren Barlow about the IA courses. Have a look in the chat, Darren. Neil Stallard has provided a response to your question. So the next question is from John Hilliard. As a RO that has owned US registered aircraft, I'm very pleased to see this long overdue alignment with the FAA regs. I'd like to know how this alignment will be maintained in future, given the temptation for individuals in CASA to regress into creating uniquely Australian regs. If I can demonstrate that a particular outcome is inconsistent with FAA's, then what process is there for review of such decisions?
Interesting question, and I sympathise. I know that particularly from looking in from the outside, CASA must seem a bit of a mess. We are subject to change. In some cases where, whilst we are the regulator, we do not unilaterally set policy. So as we've seen in this Part 43 process, we started out with some fundamentals. We do our very best to engage with industry, but ultimately we do have to take into consideration reasonable suggestions and considerations from industry. What we try to do, and this has been something that we in AEB, so airworthiness policy, has really worked towards over the last 10 to 15 years, is whilst we have to acknowledge that the rules have to be appropriate for Australia, we try to be very mindful of not going uniquely our own way to an unhelpful extent. In the very old days, the world was a less connected place, and CASA did tend to do things that were more unique. We were a different CASA back then. We had a lot of technical specialists that we don't currently have. We had our own flight testing fleet at one point. So it was a different environment, so I can understand why there is that skepticism and frustration. So we do work very hard on making sure that any variations we introduce are thoroughly tested and reasonable in the circumstances. I can't promise into the future that the future custodians of my role or anywhere up between me and the director or the government won't decide to go a different way. We've got a very clear message from the Senate committee recently looking into GA, saying that CASA needs to do more for GA, and we need to be in particular looking to align with more reasonable frameworks, more appropriate frameworks like the FARs and the New Zealand system, the US FARs. So we have listened, but I can only give you so many assurances. So there will always be variations. That's just a reality. We do try, however, to make sure that they are reasonable and logical and sustainable. So if you do have any particular concerns, then by all means, we're happy to look at them. But I think that what we've got here is what I would call a reasonable compromise. We have not copied every single word from the FARs. We have, I think, achieved roughly analogous outcomes. There are some variations. We believe they are warranted and overall for the better. So there will be people who disagree with that. But for every person who disagrees, there's another person who agrees or another person who disagrees in a different way. So that's just the reality of the policy development process. I can only, again, give you assurances of best efforts.
Thanks, Ben. We have another question from Frank Zimmer. It's in relation to specialist maintenance, for example, NDT. Why has Part 43 AMTC1 relaxed the competency requirements for NDT from the known qualification and certification standards AS3669 or EN4179? Do you want to take that one, or will I direct it to Mick?
Sure, direct that one off to Mick. At a high level, before Mick gets into the details, the AMTCs have been a bit of a concern for people, particularly in relation to what you're talking about there with formal qualification frameworks. To be clear, the current arrangements are not National Vocational Education Training System requirements, but we are more than happy, and we do intend to work with the industry reference committees and whatnot that develop the training packages for the NVET system. CASA doesn't control that system, and it is slow and torturously slow. I'm sure many of you are aware of the issues we've had with the licensing, Part 66 licensing training packages, where it has taken years to get changes into that, both to fix old issues and to align the licensing training with the Part 66 standards. So we would like to align more closely with the VET system. We absolutely will adopt relevant VET qualifications as acceptable means of compliance for those qualifications, but completing that as a full subset is going to take a while. In the meantime, it will essentially be business as usual with appropriate flexibility for the GA sectors around. CASA has discretion to grant authorisations. We have internal procedures around how we establish that competency, and those are freely available. You know, they're not meant to be secret. So anybody who wants to be a welder or an NDT person, you know, we're absolutely able to share that information with them, so they know what they need to do in order to get those authorisations. So Mick, maybe you'd like to jump into the detail a bit there.
Cool. Yes. The AMTC with regard to NDT is still a work in progress. The problem we're contending with is that AS 3669 is framed around maintenance organisations and working in conjunction with a level 3 NDT person, and that doesn't work for Part 43. So at the moment we're talking to specialists in the industry, trying to work out a way to allow people to get an AMTC for NDT work that provides for the same standard of qualification without requiring the affiliation with a maintenance organisation. That's the best I can give you at the moment.
I appreciate the answer. Thanks very much. It's Frank Simmer here. All right. We're
on the
this,
subject of, oh, sorry, Frank, you're still talking.
That's right. I know. I guess the concern is that the industry would say, well, we don't want to be in a situation where we have unconsciously incompetent people in the industry, people that believe they're doing the right thing and not aware of, how would say, the advances in the process, and hence that's why we have the formal frameworks. But I appreciate that the level 3 and the engagement of level 3 is probably arduous for the Part 43 organisation. But all right, I sit on the National Aerospace NDT board. We'll make some comments back to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Frank. Mick, on the subject of ATMCs, we do have another question, so I will. Oh, no, don't worry about that. Neil's just posted a response. So, Rob, your question about the AMTCs, will they be perpetual? Neil Stallard has just put an answer for you in the chat. Stephen, I can see that you have your hand up. I'm not ignoring you. I'm just going through all your questions. So
that one was specifically in relation to Frank's question. And the answer, I think, to Frank is that CASA, when they pulled the requirements, the repairment certificate requirements out of the US FARs, left off the first 4 or 5 dot points, which required the repairman to be qualified and employed and deemed competent by the employer before he's issued the repairman certificate in the US. So all CASA brought over was the requirement for 18 months experience or a course. Now, if you added back in what the FAA required, which was to be a qualified person doing that activity in the first place, Frank's problems would go away. But for some reason, CASA's missed the first part of that, which is the qualified person with 18 months experience, and just left in a person with 18 months experience.
So I suppose, Steve, you're probably seeking a comment there. That overall, what we're trying to do is make sure that we have achievable, attainable permissions. As we move up through the spectrum, they become more and more framed around formal qualifications through things like official licenses. As you move down, there is more flexibility. So we are working on trying to make sure we have a spectrum of appropriate qualifications and standards for the circumstances. So we don't want to provide a blanket approach. We obviously, as a regulator, we like formal qualifications. That gives us a higher degree of confidence and safety assurance around granting the permission. But as we move down through the spectrum of Part 43, which is massive, there's so much going on down in that bottom sector. We need the flexibility to be able to authorise people without necessarily holding a formal qualification. So at the moment, we have a fairly outcome-based arrangement. That's appropriate in most circumstances, but our internal procedures for granting authorisations supplement an outcome-based arrangement. So just because the regulation doesn't specify a specific qualification doesn't mean that that kind of standard would not be applied in a decision-making process if it's appropriate in the circumstances.
And from the law's perspective, the MOS says, if I've got 18 months experience, I'm entitled to be issued the AMTC. If you refuse to issue it to me, I can take it to the AAT and you would have to give it to me. You've missed out the really important safety mechanism of the US FARs that require a person being issued the AMTC or repairment certificate to be first qualified with experience. It's a fundamental competency-based approach to issuing a permission to someone. You can't just say, well, we threw that bit away because it was a bit difficult to fit in and it's just as safe. Because it's clearly it's not.
Sure, okay, well, we can have a look at that, but the intent obviously is that they need to demonstrate appropriate competency in the circumstances. I don't think the AAT would uphold a decision where a person cannot demonstrate appropriate competency. There might be a difference of opinion as to what is appropriate, in which case the AAT has a very important role. But obviously our intent is to make sure that the competency, be that in the form of any or all of a combination of those qualifications, knowledge, skills, experience, attitude, are appropriate in the circumstances. So sure, we'll have a look at that and make sure that we're not tying ourselves into a position where we would be forced to authorise an incompetent person.
Now, Steve, I've noticed that there are a number of questions from you and we're not going to have time to answer all of them. So what I'd like to put to you is, would you like to prioritise them, ask one? And as Ben has suggested, he's more than happy to arrange a one-on-one with you to go through what we haven't been able to cover today.
Yeah, look, sure. Thanks for that opportunity, Fiona. The most important one I would say was there's a question I put at 253 about power plant mechanics. If we can maybe
253, is that the one US FAA certified mechanic?
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay, I'll ask away and then I'll put that to Ben. So Steve's question is, a US FAA certified mechanic isn't permitted to certify for a power plant if they aren't rated for power plant. Why is a Part 66 LAME with a power plant exclusion permitted to certify for power plants?
Mick, that's a pretty detailed question. I don't know if we could comment exactly on the extent of the privileges of the FARs. It sounds that, I don't know, Mick, do you understand the first part of the question around an AMP who doesn't have a rating for power plants?
Oh yeah, He's quite correct. The two ratings are either airframe or power plant, or they can have both, and they can only certify within the scope of those ratings that they hold. However, in Part 43, we're saying that even if you have an engine exclusion, if you have the underpinning knowledge, in other words, we require you to have passed the necessary knowledge examinations, then you have sufficient knowledge to be able to show how to do specific tasks. We're not saying that you have the knowledge and experience to do all engine certification, maintenance and certification, but for each task that you've demonstrated that you can satisfactorily perform it, you can then in future perform that task.
All right, so I get the point of that question. Mick, maybe this is a good opportunity for you to explain how LAMEs can expand their privileges under Part 43 on that task assessment, more generally than just that specific example. Because from my perspective, Steve, I suspect you've seen a thing that says that a person can sign outside of that scope without necessarily having seen the other bits that underpin how they can gain incremental expansion of their privileges. So, well, Mick, do you want to explain that more generally?
Yeah, I was just looking at the MOS. So in reference to the MOS, which is the additional privileges for B 1.1, 1.3, 1.4 LAME, there's nothing about additional experience. It's just if you've passed an exam, you can now start working on engines. If you think you've done it before, there's nothing about being shown. The MOS is the MOS, stands alone.
Oh, you haven't read the MOS properly, I'm sorry.
Well, I can only go on what's in front of me in words.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to provide you with more detailed information, but I'd be happy to doing that offline and getting into a long-winded discussion here.
Well, yeah, the MOS says what it says. That's what we've got to go on.
Yeah.
Sure. Look, so yeah, Steve, you've already sent in a bunch of questions. We'll get to them.
Okay. Just finally, Ben, the point is the FAA A&P, the P rating for any aircraft in the States requires competency-based assessment from the FAA. We've decided we're not going to do that, but we're going to sell this as being equivalent to the FAA with the same safety standards.
Right, okay, well, we'll have a look at your question. I think that sort of 20-word or less summary is perhaps a little bit unfair. We have, through the legislation, tried to establish the policies. If it turns out you have identified a flaw in the legislative drafting where we are not accurate reflecting our intended competency-based policies, then thank you, and we will fix that. I'm pretty sure it'll come together pretty well. Our legal drafters are a pretty good bunch, but we'll absolutely make sure that that isn't something that it isn't intended to be. So, we'll get to the rest of your questions as well.
Thank you, Ben. Just before we close, I do see another hand up. So Chris Boyd, you have a question before we wrap up?
Yes, just following on from that question about privileges for the Part 66 licence holders. So in regards to type rated aircraft or what were type rated engines, if, for example, a B1.3 licence holder who has done all his Part 66 exams to work on all aspects of that aircraft, including the power plant, if he goes up to a type rated aircraft or an aircraft with a turbine engine, which previously would have required a course for him to receive the type rating to work on that, is he under Part 43 able to work on that turbine engine without having that type rating?
Mick, you can answer that one.
Sure. When you say work on the engine, that's a qualified yes. The person has the underpinning knowledge, has not been trained on the engine itself, therefore they can only perform tasks on that engine that they have satisfactorily performed under the supervision of somebody who is permitted to certify for completion of the task. They have to keep a record of having done that and produce it on request by CASA.
Okay, so that's good. So essentially, someone who hasn't worked on a type-rated aircraft before, if they have done the work under the supervision of someone else, even though they have not done a Part 147 course or have that type rating shown on their license, because it falls within the broader category of B1.3, they can work on it.
That's a reasonable assumption, reasonable statement, yes.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Well, I think we might go into wrap up. We've gone way over time, but thank you everybody for your patience. Thank you for your questions. And Stephen, as Ben said, we will go through your questions after the session has finished, and we will get answers to you as soon as we can. So the plan is that we will email participants after the session and provide you with any additional information covered during the sessions. As I said, any questions that we have not been able to address during this session, we will get an answer to you. And as we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we did record this, so we will get a copy of the video up on our YouTube channel as soon as we can. If you haven't already done so, please visit our consultation hub and give us your feedback before the 19th of June. And oh, there's the consultation. And given the interest in our online webinars, we've put some additional ones on, as you can see. So we've got next Friday and Thursday the 16th of June, and we will be visiting Cairns and Adelaide. So if you are close to Cairns and Adelaide on those days, please jump online and register. So thank you all very much for your attendance, and enjoy the rest of your day.